It all came undone on a Tuesday. The kind of day that forgets its own name. There was no thunder, no grand unraveling, just silence. The kind that creeps into a man's life like dust, quiet, invisible, until it buries him whole. Nathan Hale sat at the kitchen table in his one-bedroom apartment, the email still open on his laptop screen. "We appreciate your time with us. Unfortunately, due to restructuring." He didn't finish reading. He didn't need to. The job was gone. After 12 years. Just like that. But strangely, it wasn't the job that broke him. It was what came next. He turned to say something, to call out for Sarah, maybe make a bitter joke about corporate loyalty, but the chair across from him was already empty. Her coffee mug was missing too. On the counter sat a single envelope with his name. Not Nathan, just Nate. In her handwriting. She had left that morning quietly, packed her things while he was still asleep. It wasn't an angry goodbye. It was worse. It was exhausted. A slow departure from a life that had been on pause for far too long. He sat there for a while, unmoving, not even blinking. The clock ticked, above the stove, each second like a nail in a coffin. Then, as if out of spite, it stopped. 9:03 a.m. Tuesday morning. And for a moment, Nathan imagined that time had given up on him too. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He cleaned the mug she left behind, wiped the counter, closed his laptop, and checked the mailbox downstairs. Inside, a single letter from the hospice. His father, whom he hadn't seen in 5 years, was dying. That night, Nathan stood at the window, watching the city flicker like it was trying to remember how to breathe. He wasn't angry, not even surprised. What startled him most was how unsurprising it all felt. As if every moment of his life had been leading quietly to this collapse. He had always told himself he was waiting for the right time, to write that novel, to start his podcast, to move cities, to propose, to leave, to live. But the right time had a funny habit of never arriving, and now, in the span of a day, everything he had used to delay the dream was gone. He found himself at a bus station the next morning, ticket in hand, eyes hollow. The ride to the hospice town took 4 hours. He stared out the window the whole way, watching telephone poles race each other across dead fields. When he arrived, the receptionist led him down a quiet hallway that smelled of lemon disinfectant and old flowers. "Your father's been asking for you," she whispered. Nathan nodded, though he didn't know what he'd say. He hadn't spoken to the man in 5 years, not since the last fight. The one where his father said, "Dreamers drown when they forget how to swim." And Nathan, in turn, had said nothing, only left. Now the old man was behind door 12B, and Nathan, still not ready, stood frozen in front of it, his hand raised but unmoving, like a man about to knock on the door of his own life. Then, from down the hallway, came a slow, scraping sound, a mop dragging across linoleum. The janitor, tall, silent, perhaps in his 70s, paused briefly to glance at him. There was no expression, just recognition, like he had seen this scene 1,000 times. Nathan lowered his hand. He wasn't ready. He walked away from the door and found a bench by the window, sat down. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves in circular patterns, as if nature itself was stuck in some invisible loop. In that moment, Nathan realized he wasn't mourning his job. He wasn't grieving Sarah. Not even yet his dying father. He was mourning himself. The version of him that never came to life. The one who waited too long. The door creaked open like a sigh from time itself. Room 12B. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and old pages, like someone had tried to clean memory itself but failed. Nathan stepped in slowly, heart thudding in his throat. There, beneath a thin white sheet, lay a man who once cast a shadow so large Nathan couldn't see himself when he stood beside him. His father, lean now, worn to the bone. Grey hairs curled at the temple. A pale oxygen mask clung to his face like a last word that never made it out. Nathan stood there, stiff and uninvited, like a guest in his own story. "I wondered when you'd show up," came a faint voice. Not from the bed, but from behind him. It was the janitor, same mop, same expression, calm as ever, as if he'd been sweeping regrets for decades. Nathan blinked. "You know me?" The janitor chuckled softly. "Everyone who walks into 12B walks in with a storm. Yours just has more thunder." Nathan looked back at the bed, then away. "I don't know what to say to him," he admitted. "We haven't talked in years. Not really. Not since." He stopped himself, as if the words were too expensive. The janitor nodded, leaning slightly on the mop. "He's not here for words. He's here for silence. That's where truth lives now." Nathan frowned. "What does that even mean?" Instead of answering, the old man told a story. There was once a boy who lived on a cliff. Every day, he threw stones into the ocean to prove he was strong. He never noticed the small boat below, with a fisherman quietly patching the holes his stones caused. Years passed. The boy grew into a man. The fisherman grew tired. One day, the boat sank. Not because of one big stone, but because of all the tiny ones he never apologized for. And the man on the cliff? He realized too late that all his strength had been spent proving something to someone who just wanted peace. Nathan sat down slowly. The bench creaked like it agreed with the story. "I was angry," Nathan said quietly. "My whole life he made me feel small. I became successful just to spite him. Then when I lost everything, I blamed him. It was easier that way." The janitor simply nodded. Spite is a poor substitute for purpose. Nathan's eyes trailed to his father's motionless hand. The hand that once grabbed his arm too hard during arguments. The hand that never offered a congratulatory pat at his graduation. The hand that now, under all its frailty, looked human. Not monstrous. Not powerful, just old. The past doesn't end. It simply waits. In hospital beds, in unopened letters, in the space between two people pretending they were never hurt. Nathan stood up. He approached the bed slowly, each step peeling a layer of armor from his chest. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I was wrong too." No movement. He sat beside him, staring at the slow rise and fall of his father's chest. "I hated you for things I didn't even understand. I wanted you to say sorry, but maybe I never asked why you were the way you were. Maybe I never asked what you lost before you raised me." The room was silent, but not empty. It was filled with something heavier than pain. Forgiveness. Not yet. Spoken, but beginning to grow. And somewhere deep inside, Nathan felt the first tear slide down, not out of weakness, but out of a long-awaited surrender. The room was still, as if time itself had stopped breathing. Nathan sat beside his father's hospice bed, the folded envelope resting in his hand like a forgotten truth. The name written across it, Nathaniel, a name he hadn't heard in years, now sounded ancient, reverent. It was what his father used to call him when he was a boy, before the silence, before the walls. He hesitated, thumbs trembling. The paper smelled faintly of disinfectant and something older, cologne maybe, or dust from memories long buried. He opened it. The first line hit harder than he expected. "If you're reading this, then the man I once was is already gone. And perhaps the one I hope to become lives somewhere in you. Nathan's breath caught. The voice he hadn't heard in years was suddenly louder than ever. Not through sound, but through these fragile lines of ink. I was never good with words, Nathaniel. I learned how to build homes, fix pipes, survive war, but not how to hold a conversation with my own son. A lump built in Nathan's throat. His eyes flicked up to his father's chest, still rising and falling, still here, but barely. You were always sensitive, always searching for meaning in everything, and I mistook your depth for weakness. That's a mistake I carried, like a stone in my chest. Nathan remembered the fights, the silence after, the slammed doors, the unspoken expectations, the ones he failed, the ones he never understood. He thought his father had never seen him, but the truth was more painful. He had. He just didn't know how to say it. The day your mother died, I broke. You were 10. You needed a father. I became a ghost. The letter pulsed with a rawness that made Nathan's hands tremble. It was as if every word came from a place stitched with regret and stitched too late. I wasn't angry at you, Nathaniel. I was angry at myself for not knowing how to love you the way you needed. I saw you growing distant, and I thought if I was harder on you, you'd come back. But all I did was push you further. Nathan wiped his face. He hadn't even realized the tears had fallen. The hospital walls began to blur. He was no longer in the room. He was 10 again, then 15, then 23. All the ages he stood in front of this man, waiting, wanting. And now, this letter. A whisper from the end of the world. There's something you need to know. There was a moment. I wanted to tell you everything. I wrote you a letter 10 years ago. I never sent it. He looked up sharply. I left it with an old friend who worked night shifts at this place. He was a janitor then. You've probably met him, kind soul. Said he'd wait until the time was right. Nathan froze. The janitor, the parable, the timing, a strange wind stirred inside him, like realization opening a door he didn't know existed. I asked him to give you that letter if you ever came here, if you ever forgave me enough to walk through that door. Nathan clutched the current letter. Tighter, almost shaking. The air in the room thickened. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't chance. The janitor was meant to be there. That metaphor about the boy and the fisherman, it wasn't just a parable. It was a confession. A way of saying, I knew I failed you, but I never stopped hoping you'd return. The final lines of the letter were barely legible, as if the hand that wrote them had grown weaker with each syllable. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope this brings you peace. You're more than I ever was, Nathaniel, more than I ever told you. Live the life I didn't know how to. I love you. There was no signature, just space, empty and open like a door left ajar. Nathan sat in silence, the letter pressed to his chest. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a pause, like a moment before a beginning. Then he heard it, faint, but there, a sharp, continuous tone. The hospital monitor, flatline, the world tilted. He turned toward the bed, and everything in him shattered. He stared at the silence. It was louder than any scream he'd ever heard. The monitor let out that long, unwavering tone, the one every soul dreads. The flat line, the final declaration that time has run out. Nathan's breath caught in his chest. For a moment, he didn't even blink. His eyes were locked on the lifeless frame of the man who had given him life, and then withdrawn from it. The nurse entered quickly, as if to take over, but Nathan lifted one hand. Not yet. He walked to the edge of the bed and looked at the body not as a son, but as a man who had spent years building resentment, only to discover too late that the bridge back had always existed. It had just been hidden under layers of pain. Nathan slid the letter back into his pocket. His hands trembled. His voice found no words, so he whispered with his eyes, "I forgive you." The old man didn't hear it, but maybe, in some echo of the universe, he felt it. The days that followed moved like ghosts, the kind that haunt not because they scream, but because they watch. Nathan buried his father on a gray Tuesday. The sky mourned, but the world didn't stop. Emails still came. Traffic still honked. Strangers still laughed outside coffee shops. But something in him had changed, something irreversibly sharp and raw, like skin pulled from the bone. He sat alone in his father's study that night, the one room he was never allowed in as a boy. The bookshelves were filled with unread lives, the desk still holding the indent of the man's elbows. There were photos, black and white, curled at the corners, of a younger father, smiling in ways Nathan had never seen. He found a leather-bound journal in the bottom drawer, and inside, years of half-written entries, thoughts, pain, attempts. I don't know how to be a father when I still don't know how to be a son. He looks at me with anger, but I think it's just a reflection of mine. Today, he slammed the door, but I deserved it. I wanted to follow him. I didn't. I never told him I loved him. I hope someday he understands I tried the only way I knew how. Each line was a dagger and a balm. Each sentence gave Nathan something he never thought he'd receive. Context. He wasn't hated. He wasn't abandoned. He was misunderstood by a man who misunderstood himself. A week later, Nathan found himself standing on the edge of the ocean, the same cliff he'd visited as a child, where the waves threatened to swallow the sky. In his hand was a torn page from the journal, one that simply said, "Let him be free of my mistakes. Let him write a better story." Nathan read it aloud to the wind, and then with a quiet exhale, he let the page go. The wind caught it, carried it, and delivered it to the mercy of the sea. And in that moment, the moment the page disappeared, so did the weight. That night, Nathan returned to the janitor's bench outside the hospital. The man was sweeping again. "You never told me your name," Nathan said. The janitor smiled. "Names are like doors. Not all of them need opening." Nathan nodded. "He's gone." "I know," the janitor said, still sweeping. "He wrote me a letter, and I found his journal. He wasn't what I thought." The janitor stopped, looked up. "Nobody is." Nathan sat beside him. "He told me to live the life he didn't know how to." "And will you?" the janitor asked. Nathan looked out toward the empty street. "I think I already started." The janitor leaned back on his broom, then shared one last story. "You know, there's a tale of a tree that grew in silence. No birds sang to it. No sun reached it. But its roots, they traveled deep, deeper than any tree around it. When the storm came, the tall trees fell, but the silent one remained. Not because it was loud, but because it endured." Nathan listened closely. "You were the silent tree," the janitor said. "But now you can grow toward the sun." Nathan stood, this time feeling lighter. And as he walked away, he didn't look back. Not because he didn't care, but because he finally forgave the version of himself that had been waiting for someone else to change first. The phone's shrill ring shattered the quiet of the dawn. Nathan's hand hovered, reluctant, before he answered. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the kind of voice that speaks with authority but without malice. "Mr. Harris, this is Amelia from the Foundation. We've reviewed your father's final journal and the letter you sent. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to lead a new community program, one dedicated to helping families reconcile through the kind of healing your story reflects." Nathan's breath caught. For years, he'd felt trapped by the mistakes and silence between him and his father. Now, The chance to turn pain into purpose stood before him. I want to help," he said softly. That afternoon, Nathan walked into a bright room filled with strangers, faces marked by grief, hope, and hesitation. The walls were covered with stories, poems, photographs of loved ones lost or estranged. The air smelled of fresh paint and whispered beginnings. As he took a seat, a woman approached with a gentle smile. "Welcome," she said. "This place is about transformation, about turning the hardest days into the lessons that set us free." Nathan looked around, remembering the janitor's story of the silent tree. He thought of the storm, the roots, and how endurance was the quietest strength of all. The sessions were not easy. Each story shared was a mirror held up to the soul. Nathan listened as others bared their regrets, fears, and fragile hopes. Sometimes he spoke, carefully, honestly, about his father, his anger, his forgiveness. One day, during a quiet moment, the woman who had welcomed him told him a story. "Imagine a river," she began. "The river flows strong and wild, carving through mountains and valleys. But at times the river meets a rock, unmovable, cold. The water does not stop. It moves around, sometimes eroding the rock, sometimes finding new paths. The river adapts, always forward." Nathan thought about his own journey, the stones of anger, the cliffs of regret, and how he had learned to flow around them instead of crashing against them. Weeks turned into months. Nathan found himself waking with a new kind of lightness, a clarity that had seemed impossible before. The community grew, stories intertwined, and healing began. One evening, after a session, Nathan sat alone watching the sunset bleed into the city skyline. His phone buzzed, a message from Amelia. "Your father's story is inspiring more people every day. You've turned pain into purpose. Keep flowing." He smiled, feeling the weight lift further. As night fell, Nathan reflected on the man he once hated, and the man he had come to understand. His father had been trapped in his own fears and flaws, just like Nathan was trapped in his ego and silence. But both had reached for redemption in the end. Before sleep claimed him, Nathan whispered to the empty room, "Every storm passes, and every river finds its way." If this story touched a part of you you've been trying to ignore, if Nathan's journey reminded you of your own battles, then don't let this moment fade into silence. Like this video if you believe your pain has a purpose. Subscribe if you're ready to turn your darkest days into your greatest strength. Comment below. Tell us, what lesson did life teach you on your hardest day? And above all, watch the next video because your story isn't over, it's just getting started.